This morning in our journey through the Gospel of John, we get to deal with Jesus' famous statement, "I am the good shepherd." And really it's in the midst of a longer analogy that he's talking about, and it really is contextually significant, and so we'll spend some time talking about that, as well as what it really means for us today practically. So, if you have a copy of the scriptures, you can turn to John chapter 10. If not, no worries, we'll have it on the screen for you. John chapter 10, we're going to read verses 1 through 21. This is Jesus talking. "Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees." So if you remember, sorry, I only made it 3 words in. I'm already going to start talking. If you remember the whole context, there's this back and forth between Jesus and the religious leaders, the Pharisees, who are not wanting to believe him, who are spiritually blind, we talked about last week, and can't see Jesus for who he is. And so this whole analogy is set up to be spoken directly in many ways to the Pharisees, but ultimately to everyone else who's hearing it then and listening to it now. "So very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief or a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he's brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice." Here's John's commentary. "Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them," spiritually blind. "Therefore, Jesus says again, 'Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I have received from my Father." The Jews who heard these words were again divided. Many of them said, "He is demon-possessed and raving mad. Why even listen to him?" But others said, "These are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon even open the eyes of the blind?" The word of God for the people of God. So what on earth is going on in this analogy? Well, as often is the case, Jesus is picking analogies or allegories or parables at times that fit well into the first century world in which he is speaking. And so we might not choose today in 2024 to make sense of a story by telling a story about sheep and shepherds, because it's not very relevant to our culture and our world. But in the days of Jesus, it was eminently relevant. But I want to suggest to you that it's not just that it was an interesting way to make a point. Jesus is actually making a theological statement about himself when he says this. And here's why it is. Because the allegory or the analogy of being sheep in need of a shepherd has always been an example or an analogy used of Israel throughout the Old Testament, right? Jesus isn't just picking this up because it will make sense for him in the moment. He's picking up on an analogy the prophets have long used. Specifically, Israel is talked about as sheep in need of a shepherd. That is, that the shepherds that they have had have not necessarily led them well, and they have run amok, they have wandered off, they have led themselves in their own destruction. You read through the prophet Isaiah, this is what you're hearing time and time again. Sheep without a shepherd. And ultimately, if you're aware of the history of the Jewish people in the Old Testament, what is going on there, the prophecy that's happening there, is that Israel is going to end up in exile, away from God and outside the land. But then there's also prophecy in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 34, and I wanted to read it, but there's too much, so I'm going to summarize it for you, and it would be a great text to soak in this week if you're interested. And then you could actually tell someone, hey, I read some of Ezekiel once, right? It's not always the book that people jump to. Ezekiel chapter 34, God is prophesying, or God is speaking through the prophets about a return from exile. And in it, he's saying that he's done with the previous shepherds, that they've done such a bad job, that they've misled Israel, that he's casting them away. And instead, he is going to come and be a shepherd for his people. And that he will care for them and protect them like no other hired shepherds could, and like they had not done. So when Jesus makes this analogy, he's saying something very particular. He's saying, Israel is sheep in need of a shepherd, and I'm the one that the prophet Ezekiel talked about. Now the problem with that, for some people, is that, wait a minute, God said that he would come be our shepherd. And if we ask that question of Jesus, his answer would be, exactly, right? And this is what he's saying constantly through the Gospel of John, that the Father and I are one. I am God, and I am this good shepherd. So this becomes the context in which we make sense of this, and it becomes really, really important, right? So of course, at a very logical level, when Jesus makes a statement like, I am the good shepherd, that necessarily means that there probably are bad shepherds out there, right? Because if there's only such thing as a good shepherd, then there would just be a shepherd. But when you have to identify yourself as a good shepherd, you're putting yourself in juxtaposition to all the other would-bes, as it were. And of course, this lines up perfectly with Isaiah's prophecy and Ezekiel's prophecy. And who is exactly in the crosshairs? Who were the bad shepherds? Who's Jesus talking to? The Pharisees, right? The Pharisees, the religious leaders, the kings, these were the people who God had instituted over his people to help lead them in purity, to help care for the less fortunate, to help center them around the covenant, and to have them function in the way they were meant to be. But the corruption in Israel was from the top down, and it led to all kinds of things. And so Jesus is speaking a prophetic analogy right into the face of the people he's talking about. When he says, I'm the good shepherd, what he's also saying to the Pharisees is, and you aren't. Ouch. But being spiritually blind as they are, what does John say about them? They have no idea what he's talking about. Now this should fascinate us, right? Because the Pharisees spent all of their time studying the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible that they had. They would have known the prophets, and this should have made utter sense to them what he was talking about, and yet they couldn't see it, or at least wouldn't see it. And this is telling about them. In essence, it is the very thing that makes them not good shepherds, because they can't see what God is doing and lead the people in it. The people are seeing, but the leaders aren't. So they're making accusations against Jesus. You're a demon-possessed. You're a liar. You're making all of this up. And Jesus said, if I was a thief or a robber, I wouldn't come out in the open like this. I'd hop the gate over back there in the middle of the night and take and steal what I wanted. But I'm coming to you publicly, and I'm actually coming to you in purity. And he says something fascinating. He says, and listen, the gatekeeper has let me in. In essence, this is God's will and God's design. Get with the program, Pharisees. I am the good shepherd, the one who is going to lead the people of God out of exile and back into the fullness of life. So if you remember, and we've talked about this from time to time, and some folks are newer, and this takes a lot of time to process, so let me just give you a sweeping overview again, and hopefully it kind of lands or resonates just a little bit. If you remember, in the Old Testament narrative, it presents to us this picture of God's ideal, right? So that God desires to be with his people in a land of blessing. So you have that in Genesis 1 and 2 in the Garden of Eden. It's broken by sin, but you have it again ultimately on the heels of the Exodus, where God is bringing his people again in covenant relationship into the promised land, as it was called, a land flowing with milk and honey. But it's really less to do with a geographical land than it is to do a place that God can reside with them and therefore bless them. But what happens ultimately in that promised land is they go astray, sheep without a shepherd. They fall away. They're into exile. And so they're into Babylonian exile. The Babylonians are captured by the Persians. The Persians are captured by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great dies and separates his empire into quadrants. So the Seleucids rule over Israel for a while. Then the Ptolemies rule over Israel for a while. And then there's some rebellion where the Hasmoneans, so there's an internal government for a while, but it's corrupt even in itself. And ultimately the Romans come in, and when the New Testament is written, that's what's happening. And so you have this picture of the people of Israel who have never returned from exile. Ezekiel 34 has never happened. There's a temple there, but God's presence had never descended again to be in the temple. So there's land, but it's hollow and it's barren. But to return from exile means to once again be in the presence of God, God living with his people and therefore blessing. So when Jesus is saying that he's the good shepherd, he's saying that's what he's coming back to restore. But not in a geographically bound way, right? We've been getting that all through the Gospel of John. John is like, well, there was a temple and now it's Jesus, right? Well, there was an old covenant and now there's a new covenant in Jesus. And so now Jesus says what? I am the gate, the entrance into this new land, this new pasture. I'm the one who's going to give you life and life to the fullest. That's promised land language because of the presence of God. So when you think in the Old Testament, you think of language of promised land, think about full life. Think about having an experience of a life as it was meant to be, right? You've tasted that in pieces in your life in this already not yet world. Jesus says, that's what I've come to offer, and only the good shepherd can get you there. Hired hands won't do it. Thieves certainly won't do it. You need me. Ultimately, what Jesus is saying is exactly what God has said in Ezekiel chapter 34, which is, listen, here's the problem with hired hands. At the end of the day, the sheep don't actually belong to them, right? They're in it for a purpose. They're not in it because it's theirs, right? So if you're an employee at a business, like you can be an earnest and super conscientious employee, but at a certain time, you're punching out on Friday to go have your weekend. Whereas if you're the owner and stuff needs to get done and you're a conscientious owner, sometimes you're never punching out, right? You're working. My dad was a dentist, and when you're a dentist, you oftentimes are also a small business owner. He ran his own practice. So what were Saturdays like at my house? My dad had the books open. He was entering checks and making deposits. He's the owner. He had to do it. Does this make sense? And so Jesus is saying here, listen, when I say I'm the good shepherd, what I'm saying is I'm the owner. You belong to me. The sheep belong to me. I care for them in a way that a hired hand never could. Ultimately, he says, so that I will lay down my life for them. Stunning. So Jesus is making this prophetic statement against the religious leaders of the day, to them and to anyone who will hear. Basically saying, listen, you can follow them, but they're not going to lead you out of exile. They're misunderstood. Or you can follow me, and I will lead you out of exile, back into the presence of God, the place of blessing where the full life is experienced. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen because I'm not a hired hand. I love you. You're my sheep. And so Israel is faced with a choice in that moment, right? The people who are listening to that. And John tells us that there were mixed opinions, as there always is, right? Some were like, no way. I love it, right? John's take on it was, some said he's raving mad. I would have liked to have been there to hear that statement called out. And others said, well, I don't see how he can be demon-possessed and heal blind people. What's going on here? How do we make sense of this? So we could just leave this as a first-century analogy spoken to a bunch of religious leaders and heard by some people who were forced to make a choice. Or we could also read into it a little bit. Did you hear what Jesus said? He said, I also have other sheep. A very fascinating statement, isn't it? In other words, here's this group of sheep, Israel, or the people of God. But I also have these other sheep, and eventually the two sheep pens are going to become one. What's he talking about? He's talking about people who are not ethnically Jewish. He's talking about Gentiles. He's talking about probably all of us who are here this morning. That ultimately Jesus was not just offering to be a Jewish Messiah for an ethnic group of people to lead them back to a specific thing, but he was offering, as John has always said, John 3:16, for the whole world, right? He was offering to be a shepherd for anyone who would come to him, that he could lead them to the fullness of life. Now, all of a sudden, that has incredible meaning for us. It's not just historically interesting that Jesus is making a commentary on Ezekiel 34, right? And so let's read through this just a little bit more, and I want you to think. We have four characters, as it were, in the analogy. We have the sheep, we have the hired hands, we have the good shepherd, and we have the thieves or the robbers. Let's think about that together and try to put ourselves into the analogy. Jesus has already told us we are the sheep, right? Everyone go, bah. Oh, you did it. Good, thank you. I didn't know you'd actually do that. We're committed this morning. Now, at the same time, at one level, Jesus calling us sheep is somewhat demeaning. At another level, Jesus calling us sheep is actually incredibly affirming. What do I mean by that? Well, things you've heard about sheep are in fact true. They're not the sharpest tool in the shed, right? They're not the brightest bulb out there. In fact, sheep get themselves into all kinds of crazy trouble. Just do research like what happens to sheep when they're on their own, you know? You've heard the saying stuck in a rut? That's a sheep language because they walk in the same path so much that they dig it down and they can't get out, right? It's back and forth, and they're stuck in it. You've heard of being prone? That's sheep language, right? A sheep falls over, it can't get back up. It lays there prone, fills up with gas, and its insides explode. Sheep get stuck in thickets, and they can't get themselves out. They wander and they roam all over the place. If we were to define sheep in a singular word that's not ultra demeaning, I would say it like this. They're helpless, right? They're helpless. They're not necessarily out to have all these things happen, but it happens. Jesus is saying this about us. At the same level, we have to think in a first century world, not in our modern world. Sheep were actually a picture of value. They were actually a picture of wealth. The wealthy people in the day had large herds. They didn't necessarily have large bank accounts, right? So we think of wealthy people today like Warren Buffett, and we think about all his stock options. But when we talk in the Old Testament about wealthy people, we're talking about people like Abraham. It says in the Bible he was super wealthy. Why? Because he had lots of animals. He had lots of herds. But the sheep or the animals had incredible wealth. So you have this two-sided reality of this imagery. You have helpless, lost on their own sheep, can't care for themselves, get into all kinds of trouble if left to themselves, but incredibly valuable, and therefore in need of being cultivated. And therefore, the ultimate picture of a sheep is something that desperately needs a shepherd. A shepherd who can protect it, move it to a different path so it doesn't dig ruts, keep it out of thickets, pick it up when it falls over. And a shepherd who can procure its value by feeding it the right things and sustaining it and helping it to multiply into more and more and more. The only way that the sheep can sustain its value and can be cared for and protected is with a good shepherd. You see this? The sheep could never shepherd itself. Here's what I think. Inherently as human beings, we know this is true. We know this is who we are. Inherently, we know we actually have incredible value, even though some days are low and some days are high. Inherently, we know it inherently. But inherently, we also know as human beings, we're kind of incapable, right? Now, we've got all kinds of technology, and we've got all kinds of prowess and ability and different things. I'm not just saying like we can't get up or that you would actually go home and just walk in such a path on your carpet at home that you would dig a deep hole and couldn't get out of it. But that would be fantastic, and I'd love to put that on YouTube. But nevertheless, the idea is in actually protecting ourselves or caring for ourselves or accomplishing in this life the things that God has called us to, we can't do it on our own. And I think inherently we know that. Now, in our Western American world, we're told not to admit that. We're nurtured almost from birth not to admit that. And that's why we have this deep inner struggle of trying to have external pick myself up by my bootstraps and internal desperation that I need something outside of myself in order to give me value, in order to give me security, in order to give me significance, in order to give me acceptance, in order to give me purpose and meaning. We're always pretending on the outside we can do that for ourselves, and inside desperately longing for some other way. What is that? We're yearning for a shepherd, aren't we? We know we have inherent value, but we know without a good shepherd, we're not going to get to the place we're meant to get to or be the people we're meant to be. And here's the good news. In this world, there are millions upon millions of shepherds. And here's the bad news. In this world, all of those shepherds, at their best, are hired hands. And at their worst, are thieves and robbers. And yet, we continually give ourselves to them. We follow them blindly, thinking that they're going to lead us to the full life. Hoping against hope, believing against belief that ultimately we'll get there. What are the thieves and the robbers that we tend to give ourselves to? Maybe not overtly, because if we follow the analogy perfectly, they're sneaking in, they're sneaking up on us, but they get their grip on us, don't they? Because we've not been shepherded well. Well, the New Testament talks about thieves and robbers in two kinds of ways, internal and external, right? Especially the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul would say the internal thief which is constantly at work trying to steal, kill, and destroy you, is what the Apostle Paul would call your flesh. The Greek word sarx, right? And what he means by that is that part of you that's still in rebellion against God, that part of you that wants to do your own thing, that wants to lead in your own way, that part of you that gives room to lust and to greed and to pride. All of which is constantly promising instant gratification, which is a hollow hope that is never actually full life. And there are external thieves and robbers, what the New Testament oftentimes would simply classify in broad sense as the world. Right? But we might think of as things like power or status or even wealth. Things that say if you have them, then you'll have everything you need. And actually, they're stealing from you, not giving to you. How much of our life is crippled by these things? Listen, I have not given you the full gamut of examples, but my guess is the Holy Spirit is testifying to your heart and your mind right now, the thieves and the robbers, internal and external, that are gripping onto you. That without the Good Shepherd, you will constantly be prone to. Ultimately, Jesus says, he talks about thieves and robbers. Then did you notice it? In John chapter 10, verse 10, he goes, the thief. Did you catch that? It went from plural to singular. Why? Because now he's identifying thief, capital T, right? Who does he mean? He means Satan, right? Or what we sometimes colloquially call the devil, who ultimately is running the show in terms of the world and our flesh. All those things which would be in opposition to the rule of God in our life and in the world are under the dominion of the devil. And just in case you didn't know, he's got three singular purposes: steal, kill, and destroy. Right? Don't believe any lie that any of these things are going to lead to anything else except personal theft, personal death, and destruction of all that is around you. That's the path that thieves and robbers lead us to. There are also plenty of shepherds in our world that we could classify as hired hands. That does not necessarily mean they are modern-day Pharisees per se. It's not always a one-to-one correspondence. But what would Jesus mean by using the language of hired hands? Well, at some level, these are things that are instituted by God or enabled by God in order to accomplish the purposes of God, right? So why would an owner of sheep hire a shepherd? To procure the flock as he wants it, right? That's how it works. And typically, in case you're unaware, typically a shepherd never owned the sheep, right? People who owned the sheep were wealthy, the sheep were valuable, and they hired people to come do it. So this language makes sense. So you can understand how the Pharisees fit into that model, because they were meant, the Old Testament covenant and the religious leaders, they were meant to shepherd people. They were instituted by God. But at some level, at some point, either through corruption or other things, it became about the law rather than the law pointing to the ultimate. And in the same way, so many times the hired hands in our life, the hired hand type shepherds in our lives, that are meant to be good because they point us to the ultimate, somehow get flipped and become ultimate for us, and therefore point only to themselves. Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, you're just pointing to yourself. You were meant to point to Yahweh. Think about some of those things with me, just quickly, right? God says he institutes government for our good. Should we follow government blindly? I mean, you tell me. It's a hired hand. Have your political beliefs vote in the elections, but if you're putting all your eggs in that basket, you're following the wrong shepherd. Can government be good? Of course it can. Should it be good? Of course it can, but it's ultimately meant to point us to the ultimate thing. What about family? Family is absolutely instituted by God, a wonderful and beautiful thing. But ultimately, marriage, friendships, a family and lineage, all of it is meant to be a picture of God's family. It's all meant to be pushing us towards embrace of Creator God and understanding Him. But sometimes, in fact, a lot of the time, family becomes ultimate, doesn't it? But I just remember, you should honor your family. You should love your family. I'm not telling you to disengage or anything like that, but get the order right. Don't follow your family blindly. That would be a huge mistake. And if your family, and if you as a parent or whatever aren't shepherding your family in such a way that it's pointing them to the ultimate thing, get that right. So much of our world right now is about hired hands becoming ultimate. Right? At some level, we can look at the thieves and the robbers and inherently know, we shouldn't give ourselves to that, right? I shouldn't give myself to pride, lust, greed. That's bad. I do, but I shouldn't. I know that. But the hired hands, it's sneaky, isn't it? Because we feel like, that's good. We should give ourselves to it. And at some level, so long as it's pointing you in the right way, it's good. But it's not ultimate. And we'd be remiss if we didn't use the final example to say religion. Because after all, that's the very bear that Jesus himself is poking in this story, isn't it? Think about it. Religion is not ultimate, friends. I hope that you love this church. But if at any moment we stop pointing you towards God, you better exit stage left. Because this isn't ultimate. I'm not ultimate. I'm a hired hand. I love you, but not like God loves you. And you can look at the church today. Corporately, the greed that is sunk into the church, the profit, all of the things that are happening in so many ways, the church looks an awful lot like a hired hand not doing its job. That's sad. That's incredibly sad. Think about the pain at some level Jesus must have felt to be speaking this truth to Pharisees who at some level creedally would have believed the very same things that Jesus believed, and yet were getting it so wrong. Because they had made ultimate that which was meant to point to ultimate. Let me pause and make a statement. Some of you, I know your story. Some of you have been deeply hurt by hired hands. You've been hurt by your earthly family. You've been hurt by the church. Some of you, I know your story, you've been hurt badly by the church. And I am not saying this in any belittling way or in any way to make small the pain that you have felt. But John chapter 10 is once again an encouragement for you to look to the shepherd, not to the hired hands. Not to forget the pain, not to pretend it didn't happen, but to agree with Jesus in John chapter 10 when he says, a lot of times the hired hands screw things up badly. And sometimes they're even corrupt. And we should mourn that, and we should lament that, and I stand with you, and I apologize on behalf of the church if it has done it to you. But Jesus is not mixed up in that mess. He has come to offer you the correct way to full life that others have pretended they could get for you. So we then have the last character, the Good Shepherd, who calls himself good because inherently there are those that are not good, right? And look at some of the things that he says about himself. He says, I know my sheep by name. Now, what does that mean? Think about it with me for just a second, right? These sheep don't come with names, right? Sheep doesn't arrive and have like a name tag wrapped around its head. And he didn't get them from somewhere else, right? They said they belonged to him all along. So inherently what you have Jesus saying here is that he loves his sheep so much that he gives them a name, right? Think about that. And in the first century world of Jesus, like today we have kids, we're at community group on Friday night and talking with a couple who's pregnant about possible names. And we like names because we like them and they're interesting and sometimes they have meaning. But in the first century world of Jesus, names meant everything. Because when you named someone, you were giving them an identity and at some level giving them a purpose. And when God changed your name, that was really important. Remember when Jesus changes Peter's name from Simon to Peter, he says, because you're a rock and on this rock I'll build my church. Or when God changes Abram's name from Abram to Abraham, when God changes Jacob's name from Jacob to Israel, all of these are profound things. You see, Jesus is saying to you individually, you're not just one in a giant flock. I've named you. I love you. I've given you inherent value. And I've set you on course for a significant mission. And then fascinating, he says, I lead you. Right? The gate opens and I lead my sheep. Now, I do not know much about farms or ranches or animals, but I'm pretty sure most of the time animals are moved by being driven, not being led. Where do you drive animals from? From behind. Where do you lead animals from? From in front. Now, that's a pretty bold way to go, isn't it? But Jesus does this. He's saying something really significant for us. That is that he's not calling us to some place that he is not already present, right? And that any danger that awaits in that place, he is there ahead of us to meet it head on. And he's also saying that he's confident that simply by his voice you can follow him. Not by whips or drivers or anything else. This is incredible. One commentator said it this way, that Jesus does not give us maps, he gives us himself. What does it mean to be led by Jesus? Go and do the things that he is going and doing. Follow him and what he's up to in our world. And then ultimately, Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd because I lay down my life for my sheep. That there is, in fact, coming a time when the wolves will strike, when sin has to be accounted for, when our sheepness must be dealt with. And Jesus says, I'm taking care of that for you. He's very careful to say, isn't he? I don't have to. It's not required of me. I choose to do it. As we come upon Holy Week and Good Friday, I pray that that verse resonates deeply with you. Jesus wasn't tricked into the cross. He wasn't forced into it. He wasn't coerced into it. He wasn't paid off for it. God the Father didn't make it happen. Jesus willingly embraced it. No one takes my life from me. I give it up freely. That's what love really looks like. So I ask you a simple question this morning. If you are willing to acknowledge that you are a sheep, which shepherd would you want to follow? Who do you want to name you? Thieves and robbers? Hired hands? Or the Good Shepherd? Who do you want to lead you? Thieves and robbers? Hired hands? Or the Good Shepherd? Who can ultimately solve the human dilemma, the problem of sin? Thieves and robbers? Hired hands? Or the Good Shepherd? I'm convinced that Jesus is worth giving up everything in order to follow, because he leads us to the fullness of life. So then how? How on earth do we not fall into the trap of thieves and robbers? How do we make sure that the hired hands are pointing us in the right direction? Jesus says, "My sheep know my voice." It is imperative that you learn the voice of Jesus. Don't just listen to me. Don't just listen to your favorite preachers or read your favorite authors. Please keep listening and reading them, grow. But you better learn the voice of Jesus so that you know that the hired hands are pointing you in the right way, and so that you can fend off the temptation of the thieves and the robbers. What does the voice of Jesus sound like? It sounds like the gospel. How do you know the voice of Jesus? Well, at some very basic level, through this text, we could say it like this: daily reminding yourself that you are a sheep, ultimately helpless, and yet inherently valuable. Only one shepherd says that of you. All the others lean hard on the incredibly helpless reality. And Jesus calls you by name. You pray with me? Jesus, in the Old Testament, we know the story that because of sin and brokenness, Israel ended up in exile, away from your presence. And though the story is interesting and at some level understandable, sometimes we struggle to make a one-to-one connection. And yet you remind us that we too are in exile, that we too, because of sin and brokenness, are kept a distance from God. And so in the same way that the Jewish people heard you speak this analogy, we hear it again this morning. And we acknowledge that you are the only way, the only shepherd who can lead us to the presence of God, the only shepherd who can rectify the problem of sin, the only shepherd who gives full life. Thank you, Jesus, for your willingness to faithfully and patiently call us by name. Would you allow us to learn your voice more and more deeply and more intimately as we learn and grow in following you? I pray it in your name. Amen.